I love building gaming computers. I built my first PC in 2005 and was immediately hooked. Since that time, I've built more than a dozen PCs for myself and friends and family members. So when my channel reached 20,000 subscribers back in September, there was no question in my mind that I was going to build a new gaming PC and give it away to one of my subscribers. If you haven't seen the channel's 20,000 subscriber giveaway game show, you need to hit pause on this video right now and go watch it. It's a really fun video. Before giving that PC away, I made sure to put it through its paces at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. So people out there looking to build or buy a system with similar specs can see just how this hardware performs with each other. As you know from the title of the video, for the CPU I used a Ryzen 7 3700X with 16 GB of G-Skill Trident Z 3600MHz DDR4. And for the GPU, I used a Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super Gaming OC. If you want a full list of all the parts in this system, I've included the full specs in the video description, along with links to where you can buy them on Amazon. So, without further ado, here's how it performs in the 10 games I tested this system with. First up, we have Borderlands 3 at 1080p on bad settings. While running around on foot, it almost always ran above 100 FPS. GPU usage was constantly at around 98%, so we weren't seeing any appreciable CPU bottleneck or anything like that. If you don't know what a CPU bottleneck is, please check out my video where I explain both CPU and GPU bottlenecks, as it's good to know what they are and what causes them. The link for it will be popping up in the cards right about now. When I jumped into a vehicle, it did drop under 100 FPS in some areas, but for the most part, it stayed right around 100 FPS pretty much all the time. Bumping the resolution up to 1440p, our GPU usage stays at right about the same level, but does jump up to 99% much more often. For the most part, the frame rate was in the 70s and 80s, which felt nice and smooth to me. Oh, this is on the same bad subscribe set, by the way. At 4K, the game looks really good, and our GPU utilization did reach 100%. But most of the time, the frame rate was in the 40s. Occasionally, it would even dip down into the 30s, especially at moments like this when I got into fights with multiple enemies. Even though the average frame rate was low, I felt the game was still playable because the frame times were very good. If you're not familiar with frame times, it just means I didn't have any hitching or choppiness other than what you would expect to see with a lower frame rate like that. Once again, this is on the bad settings, so it is possible to turn the settings down and bring the frame rate up. Next up, I tested Call of Duty WarZone, as it's a super popular title at the moment. At 1080p, I set all the graphics settings at their highest level, except for shadow map resolution, which I set at high rather than extra, because changing that one setting gave me a really nice uplift in the frame rate. Render resolution is also set at 100%, so it is being rendered at full 1080p. WarZone being a fairly large open-world game, the frame rate ranged a lot depending on what I was looking at after jumping from the airplane. But that, of course, doesn't really matter. It's more about what your frame rate is on the ground when you're actually playing the game. In outdoor areas, I was seeing around 120 to 130 FPS. And indoors, it would go up to between 140 and 150 FPS. GPU usage never got much higher than 97% and was often in the low 90s and would drop into the 80s when indoors. So at 1080p, I think the Ryzen 7 3700X was limiting our GPU performance a little bit. At 1440p, on the same settings I used at 1080p, the frame rate was in the 90s, but would also move up over 100 FPS at a time. GPU usage was much more consistent at 1440p, staying around 98% no matter if I was outside or inside. One thing I thought was interesting and wanted to mention is the frame rate stayed more or less the same when I was out in the boonies or in the middle of the city. Moving up to 4K, once again, with all the settings the same, everything at their highest level except for shadow map resolution being turned down one notch, I got a very consistent frame rate in the high 50s. It even reached a little above 60 FPS at times, so the 3700X and 2070 Super can give you a very nice experience in WarZone with the graphical settings set quite high at 4K. Crysis Remastered was the next game I tried, because it was a game I so wanted to play when it first came out back in 2007, but I wasn't able to afford good enough hardware to play it with until about 3 years later. I decided to use the very high settings rather than the can it run Crysis settings because the frame rate was just stupid on those settings. So I decided to turn it down a notch and see what happened. Crysis Remastered supposedly supports ray tracing, so I decided to run it on performance and see what we got. At 1080p, I feel like this system should destroy a 13-year-old game, but that is not what I saw at all. In fact, it ran below 60 FPS pretty much all the time, and GPU usage never went above 75%, and most of the time was between 50 and 60%. The only time the frame rate went above 60 FPS is when there was a lot of sky in view. Looking at my on-screen statistics here, I can see the game was heavily using only about 4 CPU threads, and most of the time, only 2 of those threads were really being used. So this suggests to me that this game has not been optimized to really take advantage of modern CPUs, but is pretty much just a port of the old game from back when dual and quad-core processors were just beginning to really become a thing. Like, graphically, compared to modern games, it doesn't even look that great either. So as much as I loved the game originally when I played it back in 2010, Crysis Remastered is a pretty big disappointment today. The 2070 Super has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and that was being fully utilized pretty much all the time, which led to some things never even being rendered. Like you can see, all this stuff should be sitting on a platform of some kind, but the platform isn't being rendered at all, so everything is just floating in the air. At 1440p, the frame rate was so bad, I turned the settings down to high, which I didn't notice until later, also set ray tracing to high, but here's how things went. GPU usage was much better, being up close to 100%, and the frame rate was also better-ish, staying in the 50s. There were times the frame rate did move over 60 FPS, but once again, that was pretty much only when there was a lot of sky in view or I was looking at the ground. As for 4K, I stayed on the high preset and turned ray tracing off, and actually had a decent experience, I guess I'd say. I was averaging around 30 to 40 FPS, but, you know, for being at 4K on high, I felt like that was okay. What I found really interesting, though, is by going down to the medium preset, the frame rate stayed about the same. But then I noticed that the game became severely CPU bottlenecked. GPU usage was ranging all over the place from 50% on up into the 90s, but the worst part was the frame times got really bad and the game got really choppy. So I guess my word of advice is don't run Crysis Remastered at 4K on medium quality settings if you've got hardware like this. Tom Clancy's The Division 2 was the next game I looked at, and at 1080p ultra settings, I got over 100 FPS, most all of the time. When I was running around in larger, more open areas, it would drop below that, but the frame rate was always plenty high enough for me. The thing that actually bothered me the most was that I was playing on a 60Hz monitor, which introduced some screen tearing, and that kind of distracted a little bit from the experience. Our GPU usage was up at 98 and 99% all the time, so right where we want it to be. At 1440p, I left it on the Ultra preset, and as you can see, got over 60 FPS at all times. The frame rate was the lowest in the large open areas, but never fell below 60. In more enclosed areas, the frame rate jumped up into the 70s, so a really nice result in my opinion at 1440p Ultra settings. For my 4K tests, I wanted to keep the frame rate as close to 60 FPS as I could, so I turned the graphics down one notch to high, and that got us pretty close to 60 FPS. The game was mostly in the 50s, but on my 60Hz 4K monitor, gameplay felt good, and I had a fun time playing. And just as a side note, the Division 2 at 4K looks amazing. I really need to get a 4K capture card so you guys can really see what it looks like. This pointing the camera at my monitor thing just doesn't quite do it justice. Our next game in the lineup is Doom Eternal. And although it is a little more difficult of a game to run than Doom from 2016, at 1080p on the Ultra Nightmare setting, I was getting over 200 FPS at all times. So yeah, you can expect super high frame rates in this game with the Ryzen 7 3700X and RTX 2070 Super. At 1440p on Ultra Nightmare settings, the frame rate was once again crazy high. Not 1080p crazy, but still high enough to take advantage of a high refresh rate 1440p monitor. The frame rate ranged quite a bit depending on what was going on screen, but it never went below 120 FPS and briefly peaked around 200 FPS. Most of the time it was in the 140 to 150 FPS range, however. Even at 4K on Ultra Nightmare, the 3700X and 2070 Super were able to keep the frame rate above 60 FPS at all times. Even in this area where I had to take on a crap ton of demons, the frame rate stayed in the 60s and 70s. Our next game is FarCry 5, and at 1080p I set it to Ultra settings, and right away looking at the GPU usage here you can see that we're being CPU bottlenecked a fair amount. Our FPS is pretty good, being in the 80s and 90s, but we are leaving some GPU performance on the table using the Ryzen 7 3700X in this title. This game really likes CPUs with high clock speeds, and the 4.2 to 4.25 gigahertz the 3700X was running at most of the time is a bit slower than this game really likes. Even at 1440p Ultra settings, the CPU bottleneck remains. As you can see, our GPU usage is still far lower than we want it to be. The frame rate is a good 20 to 30 FPS lower at 1440 than it was at 1080 due to the 78% increase in the number of pixels being rendered, but our GPU usage percentage remains about the same. It's not until we move up to 4K Ultra settings that the CPU bottleneck is no longer an issue for this game. We're finally seeing 99% GPU usage, and the frame rate is generally in the 50s with occasional jumps up over 60 FPS. I feel this game is a great comparison to show how poorly optimized Crysis Remastered is. The graphics in this game look way better, and even with a fairly heavy CPU bottleneck at both 1080p and 1440p, this game still has a higher average frame rate. Next up is the game that so many people love to hate. Yeah, that's right, it's Fortnite. For my Fortnite testing, I like to jump into a game of Team Rumble. Mostly because I suck at this game, and Team Rumble allows you to respawn and gives me a way better opportunity of capturing footage where I actually get eliminations. Also, Team Rumble packs up to 30 players in a fairly small area, so I feel it's a good way to test hardware performance. At 1080p on Epic settings, I did see a bit of a CPU bottleneck. Most of the time, GPU utilization was between 80 and 90%. Despite this bottleneck going on, I did still see a frame rate over 100 FPS though, so a much better result than other games I tested. Upping the resolution to 1440p and keeping the settings on Epic took care of the CPU bottleneck, and the 2070 Super still got around 100 FPS in the early parts of the game. Later on in the game, when all the players were packed into a much tighter space, the frame rate did dip down into the 80s. But again, this is on Epic settings, so for someone looking for a higher frame rate at 1440p, all you need to do is turn the settings down a little bit. Moving the resolution up one last time to 4K, the 2070 Super was not able to get us up to 60 FPS at Epic settings. When the Storm Circle was at its smallest, it was around 40 FPS with occasional dips into the 30s. Turning settings down from Epic to high, however, made a pretty big difference and got my frame rate much closer to a constant 60 FPS at 4K. With what I feel to be very little perceivable difference in the actual visual quality. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was slightly CPU bottlenecked at 1080p on ultra settings using the Vulkan API. Looking at the GPU usage percentage here at the top of the screen, you can see it hovering in the mid-90s. And that delivered a frame rate ranging from the 80s into the low 100s. Moving to 1440p on the same ultra settings, I still saw a slight bottleneck going on, as the GPU usage once again ranged from the 80s into the mid-90s. The frame rate was over 80 FPS most of the time, topping out around 100 FPS at times and dropping into the 70s for the low. At 4K, I tested using both the ultra settings and very high settings, and to be honest, I saw no appreciable difference in the frame rate. Our GPU usage finally made it up into the 90s, sitting at about 98% all the time. But the frame rate on both ultra and very high was always in the 40s and 50s. Red Dead Redemption 2 is the only game that I use the in-game benchmark on for my testing, just because I haven't really played this game much at all. Usually I like to show actual gameplay, because I feel that that's best demonstrates the real-world performance you'll see when playing the game. But since I haven't played this game much, I kind of took the easy way out and just ran the benchmark. Like all my other tests, I started with 1080p and set the game's quality slider to favor quality and ran the benchmark. Overall, the benchmark ran at over 60 FPS the entire time. The first part of the benchmark, where it's snowing, is actually where the frame rate was the lowest, and the highest frame rate I saw was in the last section, where your character is running through town trying to escape the law. At 1440p on the favor quality setting, in the snow I saw about a 10 FPS reduction in the frame rate over what I saw at 1080p, and that trend continued throughout the entire benchmark. Most of the time the frame rate was between 50 and 60 FPS, so for an adventure game like this, that should be perfectly adequate. At 4K, I again went with the favor quality preset, and in the snow here at the beginning of the benchmark, you can see it was getting about 35 FPS. In the final benchmark scene, the frame rate improved ever so slightly over the snow portion of the benchmark to the high 30s and low 40s. The final game in our lineup is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. At 1080p, I set the graphic preset on highest and set ray traced shadow quality to ultra. And for the most part, the game ran above 60 FPS. I did my testing by running a loop around this village because this area of the game is one of the most hardware demanding areas of the game to render. The lowest frame rate I saw was in the high 50s, and the highest was in the mid to upper 70s. I think that this is really encouraging because if you turn ray trace shadows off completely, it boosts your frame rate quite a bit, putting you well above 60 FPS. At 1440p on the highest preset once again, I had to turn the ray trace shadows down to medium in order to get the frame rate above 60 FPS. With ray trace shadows on ultra, I was getting between 40 and 50 FPS, which I feel is still totally playable for a game like Tomb Raider, but at the same time, I wanted to see how far I had to turn the ray trace shadows down before the frame rate would reach 60. Turning ray trace shadows off gave me an additional 5 to 10 FPS bump, and to be honest, I don't really notice any visual difference between the ray traced shadows on medium and turning ray trace shadows off. So I feel like you might as well turn them off and get that 5 to 10 FPS back. And that brings us to the 4K run. And holy moly, on the highest setting, this game looks so good at 4K. I mean, it's impressive looking at 1080p and 1440p, but in 4K, wow. All I can say is wow. As for the performance, you can see that I never got above 60 FPS, and this is with ray traced shadows turned off, by the way. Just in case you were wondering, turning the ray trace shadows onto ultra at 4K along with the highest graphical settings decreases the frame rate by about 20 FPS. So it took it down to an average frame rate just under 30 FPS, and 30 frames per second I feel is about as low as you want to go with a game like this. If you've made it to this part of the video, I'd like to give you a great big thank you because you're awesome and obviously you find this kind of content interesting. I know that many people would probably prefer I just show some graphs and call it a day, but I like showing actual gameplay. I feel seeing the game actually running is far more interesting than a bunch of bar charts and numbers. I do recognize there are also a lot of videos on YouTube that show gameplay with all the stats and stuff on screen like I did in this video. But those videos are usually just the gameplay, and I feel there are a lot of people that don't necessarily know what all those numbers mean, which is why I do my videos the way I do and talk about the GPU usage percentage and the amount of VRAM being utilized and whatnot. My hope is I'm helping others learn more about how computers work so they can make more educated purchasing decisions. We work really hard for our money and we all want to spend it as wisely as we can, and I just hope I'm helping you do that. Thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you again in another video real soon. We'll see you next time.